and welcome everybody to the next in our symposium series. And I'm delighted with the turnout given the wintry mix that we're experiencing. And I think that you will have quite a treat. It is really my pleasure to be able to introduce this woman because she knew me before I even knew myself in terms of my career as an academic. She was one of the first people I met when I entered Spelman College during their pre-freshman summer program. So you know it's kind of exciting to have a former professor here, but also it's kind of scary. Every time I have to send her any kind of written material, it's like I'm double checking, triple checking, because she will call me on it. Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall is the Anna Julia Cooper Professor of Women's Studies at Spelman College in Atlanta. Now she founded and has directed the Women's Research and Resource Center, which is a wonderful place for us to have research and resources about black women. And it's where I go when I get stuck about something. I'll turn to the Resource Center. The very first publication that I made was an article in Sage, and that was a very important journal. She has co-edited Sturdy Black Bridges, Visions of Black Women in Literature, Trapped African American Men on Gender and Sexuality, Words of Fire, an anthology of African American feminist thought. Mine is a tattered copy. Gender Talk, Sexism, Power, and Politics in the African American Community. Double Stitch, Black Women Write About Mothers and Daughters. She wrote also this text, which I have also used and is really wonderful. It's called Daughters of Sorrow, Attitudes Toward Black Women, 1880 to 1920. She's also a graduate of Spelman College, so I get a double dose of what it means to be a Spelman woman. When people entered into the campus, they were saying, "Oh, you're Spelman ladies." And she was quick to remind us that, no, we are women, and what it means to be women. She's one of the people who's helped define black feminist thought in a national as well as international context. And I would like to leave with these words from Words of Fire. As she gives her acknowledgments, Dr. Sheftall says to us, "And finally, I want to remember my own mother, the first feminist I ever knew. She encouraged me to live freely, be independent, sit on my own bottom, develop my intellect, treasure friendships with women, and recognize a good man when I saw one." I'd like to introduce Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall.
Always wonderful to be introduced by a former student, especially Valerie. I think, Barry, you're the only student I've had who's gotten to be an anthropologist, so I'm very proud of you. I am really pleased to have been included in this important Souls of Black Folk Centennial Symposium series here at UNC Chapel Hill. And I want to begin by thanking my friend and colleague, Joseph Jordan, whom we miss in Atlanta, though I understand his need to move on, who is the present director of the Stone Black Cultural Center, for having extended the invitation for me to speak this evening. And Joe, I don't know if you know how wonderful your staff is, but I want to just say that everything about their dealing with me prior to my getting here tonight has just been wonderful, and so I want to thank those sisters. The topic of my talk this evening is remembering our feminist forefathers. And I'm happy that there are so many men in the audience, because I think that you will find this a useful way to spend your evening. DuBois and the Souls of Black Women Folk. As we celebrate William E.B. Du Bois's classic and influential text, The Souls of Black Folk, published a century ago in my adopted home, Atlanta, Georgia, in 1903. I want to begin on a personal note and bear witness to the impact Du Bois has had on my own development as a black feminist scholar. My scholarly interests in gender issues and African American men, a focus of my talk this evening, began while I was conducting doctoral research at Emory University in the 80s for a study of attitudes toward black women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. After reading Rosalind Terborg Penn's essay, Black Male Perspectives on the 19th Century Woman, I was eager to probe further the nature of progressive gender politics among black men, whose public discourse we would now label pro-feminist. Upon the completion of the dissertation, Daughters of Sorrow, Attitudes Toward Black Women from 1880 to 1920, whose title was actually inspired by DuBois' essay, The Damnation of Women, which appeared in 1920, I intended to write several articles on the personal and historical circumstances which produced African American men who were disloyal to patriarchy in their writings and activism. But I soon realized that I had much more work to do. My interest in black feminist studies, largely invisible or maligned at that juncture in black studies scholarship, intensified during graduate school and resulted some years later in the publication of Words of Fire, a collection of non-fictional essays which traces the evolution of feminist thought among black women from the 1830s to the present. During the course of that very long project, I also began to collect pro-feminist writings by black men, going back to the 19th century, which I imagined would result in a companion volume to Words of Fire. I wanted to make the case that our century-and-a-half-old feminist intellectual tradition in this country had included brave, transgressive black men as well. I also became convinced, and so did my co-editor Rudolph Berg, that the long process of black men becoming disloyal to patriarchy would begin with a different education about their forefathers. I was certain that black boys and men needed to know that historically their forefathers not only fought for racial equality, they also fought for gender equality. They needed to be told or reminded that Frederick Douglass and William E.B. Du Bois in particular were relentless women's rights crusaders. In her compelling essay, The Souls of Black Women Folk, in the writings of William E.B. Du Bois, literary critic Nellie McKay calls our attention to what makes Du Bois such a unique figure in African American life, and I would say in American life, which connected me to him as well while I was a graduate student. And I'm now quoting from Nellie. The extent to which he includes the influences of women's experiences, and especially those of black women, on his thinking, his recognition of gender oppression, and his acceptance of the worth of his emotional and spiritual feelings makes his works distinctive. Here I think she's referring to his emphasis on the soul, the sensitive feeling component of the self, as opposed to the intellectual, which is stereotypically sometimes considered to be the masculine side. More than any African American male in our history, his 3 autobiographies demonstrate that black women have been central to the development of his intellectual thought. In his old age, he would say that he had always had more friends among black women than among black men, that he was less attracted to relationships with men of the race because many of them imitated an American culture which he did not share. We also know that he was aware, and I'm still quoting from Nellie, we also know that he was aware that the folk were not all men. If anything can be said about his views on the soul of black women folk, it is that he felt that they had struggled through to an even higher plane than black men had. Du Bois's perceptions of the souls of black folk, that spiritual essence that made survival and transcendence possible for an entire race, in spite of indescribable oppression, was most obvious in his discourse on black women. And so, what I want to do this evening is to ponder the significance of Du Bois's progressive gender politics on our contemporary situation as black folk, as a way of celebrating his work, including The Souls of Black Folk, in which the essay of The Meaning of Progress includes the heroic black female figure, Josie. I am especially interested as well in his less well-known, I'm afraid, autobiography, Dark Water, Voices from Behind the Veil, in which his essay on the damnation of women, which inspired the topic of my dissertation, appears. I want to begin this discussion with a little passage from a chapter in the Souls of Black Folk that I actually have forgotten. And I think it's not a chapter that very many people talk about. It's called The Meaning of Progress. And I'm wanting to begin by reading a little bit of this incredible chapter because I think it is one of the most poignant portraits of poor black people struggling to survive and maintain a sense of dignity. And I would also argue that the spirit of black women hovers in this chapter in very particular ways. And so that later when I start saying some things about DuBois's sensitivity to the plight of black women, I want you to remember a section of The Meaning of Progress. How many of you remember this little chapter? I did. Okay. Let me just set it up just a little bit. While DuBois was an undergraduate student at Fisk in the 1880s, he did like lots of undergraduate students do. He went and got himself a summer job. And he had a summer job in a very poor, rural black community in Tennessee. And this he did for 2 summers. And, you know, he got to know this community very well. He taught there for 2 summers, and then he left. And then some years later, I think it was over a decade, he returned to this little place in Tennessee and, you know, was asking what happened to everybody. And it's a kind of a sad story. But I want to begin with his description of Josie. Josie was one of the young black women. She was 20 years old and had not been to school. And in this place, there was not a school, and one of the things that DuBois was trying to do was to help him get a school. So this is Josie, who belonged to a particular family. There I found at last a little school. Josie told me of it. She was a thin, homely girl of 20, with a dark brown face and thick, hard hair. I had crossed the stream at Watertown and rested under the great willows. Then I had gone to the little cabin in the lot where Josie was resting on her way to town. Okay, so that's the first little mention of Josie. And then I want to read 2 more passages. By this time, he has a school, and Josie, even though she's 20 years old, is eager with her young brothers to come. Then there was Josie herself. She seemed to be the center of the family, always busy at service or at home or berry picking. A little nervous and inclined to scold like her mother, yet faithful too like her father. She had about her a certain fineness, the shadow of an unconscious moral heroism that would willingly give all of life to make life broader, deeper, and fuller for her and hers. I saw much of this family afterwards and grew to love them for their honest efforts to be decent and comfortable, and for their knowledge of their own ignorance. There was with them no affectation. The mother would scold the father for being so easy. Josie would roundly berate the boys for carelessness, and all knew that it was a hard thing to dig a living out of a rocky side hill. And then he returns after 2 years and he learns that Josie has died. The other thing that he learns is that Josie's brother was almost lynched and you know has to run out of town. But I just want to read this little passage and then just one more. When the spring came, and he's going to ask, you know, what happened to these people who had obviously had a very profound impact on his life, particularly the women. When the spring came and the birds twittered and the stream ran proud and full, little sister Lizzie, bold and thoughtless, flushed with the passion of youth, bestowed herself on the tempter and brought home a nameless child. You see this very coded language. Josie shivered and worked on with the vision of school days all fled. with a face wan and tired, worked until, on a summer's day, someone married another. Then Josie crept to her mother like a hurt child and slept and sleeps. That's a very poignant portrait of Josie, whose life never was fulfilling. And then finally, another family with whom he came in contact, the Birds, and I'm just going to read 2 sentences about one of the women that he remembers, and just a little light thing here. At last we spoke of the neighbors, and as night fell, Uncle Bird told me how on a night like that, Finny came wandering back to her home over yonder to escape the blows of her husband. And next morning she died in the home that her little bow-legged brother, working and saving, had bought for their widowed mother. I mean, I hope you're hearing the enormous sympathy and connection and empathy that he has with these women who are struggling. And then he ends, after the portrait of her, with how hard a thing is life to the lowly and yet how human and real. So I think that this is not a chapter that we think about when we remember the souls of black folk, but I wanted to have you hear that because as I go on trying to talk about Du Bois's gender politics, I would like to believe that it was his connection with these struggling, dignified, poor black families in Tennessee, and particularly the women, that really captured his heart and his soul. Now I want to go back to Darkwater, Voices from the Veil, in which the damnation of women appears. This essay includes, I would want to argue, one of the most eloquent statements on the plight and contributions of black women that I think any African American male has uttered. And I want to read from Darkwater, and it was really Darkwater that I discovered while a graduate student. No one ever had assigned Darkwater to me when I was an undergraduate student. I had read the Souls of Black Folk, but not Darkwater. And I literally discovered Darkwater just in the library at Emory, trying to work on this dissertation. And it inspired the title of that dissertation, Daughters of Sorrow. This is written in 1920, so just so you think about the historical context. As I look about me today in this veiled world of mine, and you see the veil coming back, never lost that metaphor. Despite the noisier and more spectacular advance of my brothers, I instinctively feel and know that it is the 5 million women of my race who really count. And I think that Du Bois never lost the empathy that he came to feel for those poor women that he came in contact with in Tennessee and in other places. Furthermore, the accumulated assets of the black community were wrung largely from the hearts of servant girls and washerwomen who toiled hard and have their value trod under the feet of men. He also defended the beauty of black women against the defective eyesight, this is his language, the defective eyesight of the white world, and sings the praises in this essay of such heroic figures as Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. And then there is the most moving tribute to black men, to black women, than any black man I think has ever uttered. For their hard past, I honor the women of my race. Their beauty, their dark and mysterious beauty of midnight, eyes, crumpled hair, and soft, full-featured faces. No other women on earth could have emerged from the hell of force and temptation which once engulfed and still surrounds black women in America with half the modesty and womanliness they retain. I have always felt like bowing myself before them in all abasement, searching to bring some tribute to these long-suffering victims, these burdened sisters of mine, whom the world, the wise white world, loves to affront and ridicule and wantonly to insult. One of the things that really compelled me when I was doing this dissertation was discovering that many of the really negative, contemporary attitudes that float around in African American culture about black women were just absent from this discourse. And I think it's important to remember that there was a point in African American history when black men, at least black men like DuBois, were profoundly aware of the burdens that black women suffered. And finally, my favorite, this scathing attack: I shall forgive the white South much in its final judgment day. I shall forgive its slavery, for slavery is a world-old habit. I shall forgive its fighting for a well-lost cause, meaning the Civil War. But one thing I shall never forgive, neither in this world nor the world to come, its wanton and continued and persistent insulting of the black womanhood which it sought and seeks to prostitute to its love. And implicit in that statement is this notion that black women have been the primary, the most abused victims of white racist supremacy and slavery. And this is not an idea that came with DuBois, unfortunately, to the contemporary period. Now, having made the case, I hope, with respect to DuBois's passionate commitment to the eradication of gender oppression and his particular sensitivity to the plight of black women, I want to articulate from my own vantage point how we might make use of the legacy of DuBois's embrace of feminist ideologies in the contemporary context. The pro-feminist activism and gender-progressive discourse of African American men have been largely ignored in black political history, though there is a growing body of scholarly work about black men and black masculinities. These silences surrounding a significant aspect of black men's commitments to social justice compelled the publication of Traps, African American Men on Gender and Sexuality, which was also inspired by the writings of William E.B. Du Bois. This anthology, which I think is probably outside, is the first of its kind that historicizes writings by black men who have examined the meanings of the overlapping categories of race, gender, and sexuality, and who have theorized these categories in the most expansive and progressive terms. The first imperative of Traps was to contest and dispel the widely accepted notion that black men have been hostile to feminism and played no part in its development. It is important at this junction to recall that Frederick Douglass was the first man in the United States to publicly endorse and support the elective franchise for women. He was the only black person and one of only 32 men to attend the historic Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. Traps calls all American men, but particularly black men, to reclaim a radical tradition of commitment to feminist struggle and to remember our gender-sensitive forefathers. Despite the commitment of some African American men to the eradication of sexism and heterosexism, black liberation has been conceptualized, generally speaking, in the narrowest of terms, and has focused heavily on recuperating black manhood, constructing patriarchal families, and eradicating racism. Hegemonic black nationalist discourse, characterized by both masculinist and heterosexist frameworks, has been particularly influential within activist intellectual communities and has stifled the development, I would argue, of more egalitarian models of black empowerment, free from the ideological traps of sexism and homophobia. Put another way, the tendency to conflate black freedom with black manhood, our uncritical acceptance of orthodox conceptions of gender, the celebration of normative and rigid constructions of black masculinity, and persistent denials about homosexuality have prevented African Americans from establishing the truly revolutionary communities that Toni Cade Bambara and others challenged us to imagine over 30 years ago in her groundbreaking anthology, The Black Woman, published in 1970. Her essay on the issue of roles was the first to interrogate the pitfalls of the African American community's uncritical embrace of dominant cultural definitions of masculinity and femininity. And I want to quote briefly from Toni. Generally speaking, in a capitalist society, a man is expected to be an aggressive, uncompromising, factual, lusty, intelligent provider of goods. And and the woman a retiring, gracious, emotional, intuitive, attractive consumer of goods. We have not been immune to this condition. We are just as jammed in the rigid confines of those basically oppressive, socially contrived roles. Anticipating a fundamental premise of a field in the process of emerging when he studied, Tony Cade understood that gender, by which we mean conceptions of what it means to be female and male, is a cultural construction from her study of Africa, Asia, the South Seas, and the Americas in the pre-colonial context. She reminds us that cultures have conceived of man-woman in a variety of ways, and that human nature is a pretty malleable quality. She recalls the more egalitarian nature of particular societies before contact with Europeans and Christianity. There is nothing, Tony Cade argues, to indicate that the Sioux, Seminole, Iroquois, or other Indian nations felt oppressed or threatened by their women, who had mobility, privileges, a voice in the governing of a commune. With respect to our African ancestors, she asserts, the woman was neither subordinate nor dominant, but a sharer in policy making and privileges. Painfully aware of the antagonism between our men and our women, Tony Cade insisted that we fashion revolutionary selves, revolutionary lives, revolutionary relationships by abandoning dysfunctional definitions of manhood and womanhood, which stifle the development of healthy black communities. It is fair to assert, I believe, that Tony is a spiritual daughter of DuBois and other feminist black women who envisioned a world very different from the one in which they were socialized. While it is clear that Tony Cade's admonitions were largely ignored during the male-dominant revolutionary 60s and later, I would like to believe, that a gender revolution within our communities is still possible. Echoing Tony Cade in his admonitions concerning the necessity of an active disloyalty to patriarchy, literary critic Michael Allport wrote a pioneering essay in which he reminds us that androcentric practices are learned, are transmitted by means of specific sociocultural practices in such effective ways that they come to appear natural. And through an informed investigation of androcentric and feminist ideologies, individual men can work to resist the lure of the normatively masculine. In his call for theorizing a black male feminism, Michael Allport goes on to assert that while gender difference might be said to complicate the prospect of a non-phallocentric black male feminism, it does not render such a project impossible. What is needed, he argues, is an acknowledgement that feminism represents an incomparably productive, influential, and resilient ideology and institution, and that certain instances of Afrocentric feminism provide Afro-American men with an invaluable means of rewriting and revisioning ourselves. After a description of his painful childhood, in which he articulates his difficulty achieving a gendered self-definition, because he was only able to define himself with regard to his gender in oppositional ways, that is, what he didn't want to be, he asserts the value of black feminism and Afro-American women's lit, which he embraced as a sophomore student at Brandeis University in 1977. And this is what he said: "It helped me move toward a comprehension of the world, of aspects of my mother's life," which I think DuBois was also impacted by, "and what a man against patriarchy could be and do." The radicalizing and transformative potential of an embrace of black feminist discourse among young black men would become even more apparent over the next 2 decades. Listen to this transgressive discourse of a small group of Morehouse College students who founded an organization, now defunct unfortunately, called Black Men for the Eradication of Sexism in 1994. Their mission statement, which is incredibly brilliant, and which they did on their own, not with any grown folks. We believe, number one, that although we are oppressed because of our color, we are privileged because of our sex, and therefore take responsibility for ending that privilege. Number two, we believe that our relationships with women must be based on the principle of equality. Number three, we recognize that present Eurocentric notions of manhood and masculinity are damaging to the psyche of black men and must be replaced with a holistic interpretation of manhood that acknowledges the oneness of women and men. We believe that sexism is a global form of oppression of no less importance than any other form of oppression. We believe that sexist oppression against women pervades every aspect of our communities and must be eradicated. Their final statement is a testament to their solidarity with black women, and I think it is reminiscent of DuBois and offers the possibility of reconciliation. As we fight alongside our sisters, we struggle to become whole, to deprogram ourselves. We have organized into one body because we know in our hearts and minds that as we hold our sisters back, so will we hold ourselves back. Though these young Morehouse men may have been unaware of their connections to a small group of feminist forefathers, their departed elders, it is instructive to remember the legacy of black men whose progressive writings about gender and the oppression of black women are a significant, if invisible, aspect of black political discourse. I dare say that these Morehouse students, all about 7 of them, may have also been surprised to learn that they were connected as well to one of the most revered figures in the history of the college. I'm referring to Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, former president of Morehouse College, who wrote an autobiography entitled Born to Rebel, which reveals the origins of his own feminist sensibility with respect to the treatment of black women, and recalls his own patriarchal, abusive household and the impact it had on his own adult behavior. And it's very interesting that when I try to speak to folk about Born to Rebel and this aspect of the autobiography, people don't remember it. So I want to just read this little piece of it. I cannot say that my home life was pleasant. Quarreling, wrangling, and sometimes fighting went on in our house. I got the impression early on that father was mean to our mother. He fussed at her, and when he drank too much, he wanted to fight, and he sometimes did. All too many times, we children had to hold him to keep him from hurting mother. He would take out his knife and threaten to cut her. Often at night, we were kept awake by father's loud and abusive raging. I think if mother had said nothing, there would have been fewer arguments. But mother had to talk back. Our sympathy was with her. Largely under the influence of my mother, I made a vow at 12 years of age that I would never drink liquor. My decision was not based on religious or moral grounds, but on what I saw drinking do to my father and our family. While Dr. Mays is perceived primarily as a race man and was not privy as an undergraduate at Bates College to the kinds of classes which Michael Alford and Morehouse students would take long after he left the presidency, his autobiography does reveal, I think, an understanding of the evils of male dominance, at least in the domestic arena. And I think it's interesting that we don't remember this part of Born to Rebel. An examination of the still neglected topic of African American men and feminism usually begins, as it should, with the writings and activism of Frederick Douglass and William E.B. Du Bois. Without question, Douglass was one of the most outspoken advocates during the 19th century for the full emancipation of women in all arenas of their public lives. A fellow suffragist, Fannie Berry Williams, acknowledges shortly after Douglass's death in 1895 the debt owed to him by lovers of liberty everywhere, including women. He so lived not only that men might be free and equal and exalted, but that women too, by the same emancipating forces, might come equally into the estate of freedom. His eloquence in behalf of women's rights to the equalities of citizenship is a lasting justification of women's claims and contentions for perfect liberty. By right of his manly confidence in women, and I think that's a very interesting juxtaposition, by right of his manly confidence in women, Mr. Douglass was easily the strongest and best friend American women ever had among the great men of this republic. The history of progressive women in this country cannot be written without grateful acknowledgement to the helpful and inspiring influences of the incomparable friend of all humanity, Frederick Douglass. While Douglass is known primarily as an anti-slavery crusader, he was deeply committed to an independent, organized movement to equal rights for women. On July 14, 1848, his newspaper, the North Star, carried the historic announcement of the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights gathering in the U.S. In addition, a constant reminder to his readers of his commitment to the rights of women was a slogan which appeared on every issue of the North Star: "Right is of no sex." At the 1848 convention, when it appeared that Elizabeth Cady Stanton's resolution that it was the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise was headed for defeat, Douglass, at a critical juncture, asked for the floor and delivered one of the most eloquent pleas on behalf of women's right to the vote. The resolution was then put to a vote and carried by a small margin. In 1888, a few years before his death, Douglass recalled his role at Seneca Falls and told the International Council of Women. In fact, the last gathering that Frederick Douglass attended before he died was an International Council of Women gathering. There are few facts in my humble history to which I look back with more satisfaction than to the fact that I was sufficiently enlightened at that early day, when only a few years from slavery, to support your resolution for women's suffrage. I have done very little in this world in which to glory except this one act, and I certainly glory in that. When I ran away from slavery, it was for my people, but when I stood up for the rights of women, self was out of the question, and I found a little nobility in the act. Similarly, in his autobiography, he explains why he became a women's rights man, which is related to his belief that all persons are created equal and should therefore have the right to participate fully in the affairs of government. In his riveting essay, Damnation of Women, William E.B. Du Bois, as committed to women's rights as Douglass, and I would also say probably having been influenced by Douglass, speaks autobiographically about the women as as Douglass did of his youth. And I'm now quoting from The Damnation of Women. My mother, cousin Inez, Emma, and Ida Fuller. They represented the problem of the widow, the wife, the maiden, and the outcast. They existed not for themselves, but for men. They were named after the men to whom they were related, and not after the fashion of their own souls. In his feminist critique of patriarchy, which renders women unable to forge their own identities, Du Bois anticipated the contemporary women's movement, which would articulate the plight of disempowered women in male-dominant societies. He is also critical of the institution of marriage, which in the case of his cousin Inez resulted in a life of misery. And this is Du Bois again from that essay. What was marriage? We did not know, neither did she, poor thing. It came to mean for her a litter of children, poverty, a drunken, cruel companion, sickness, and death. Du Bois's use of the term litter to describe Inez's family situation suggests an oppositional viewpoint with respect to the joys of motherhood. His refusal to idealize matrimony and mothering is underscored in his subsequent analysis of the urgency of forging a new world for women. He imagines a world of free women, set loose from the traps of patriarchy, ignorance, economic dependence, obligatory motherhood, and domestic confinement. The future woman, Du Bois asserts, must have a life work and economic independence. She must have knowledge. She must have the right of motherhood at her own discretion. The present mincing horror at free womanhood must pass if we are ever to be rid of the bestiality of free manhood. Not by guarding the weak in weakness do we gain strength. I want to call your attention to the November-December 2000 issue of Crisis, which reprinted this essay and assembled a group of women, including myself, to participate in a roundtable discussion of the text, which has largely been ignored among DuBois's writings. A few of the 9 women admitted not knowing about the text at all, which I'm sure is the case as well with many of the contemporary readers of Crisis. And I brought one, Joseph, just for you to have. They reprinted The Damnation of Women, and then there was several hours discussion of it. I have it over there. And one of the things that we called for, but they haven't done it, is that we thought it would be a good thing to assemble a group of men to also respond to Du Bois's essay. Finally, moving toward closure. Remembering William E.B. Du Bois this evening will hopefully suggest some useful solutions and cures for what ails us as black folk where gender matters are concerned. I believe that new visions of manhood, which Du Bois represents in his writings, can be liberating and healing. At the beginning of this new century, black women and men must struggle for revolutionary selves, revolutionary lives, revolutionary relationships, which Tony K. Bambara asserted 3 decades ago. Rejecting the traps of patriarchy and sexism, which Du Bois compelled us to do 60 years ago, black folk might continue our journey toward freedom in racist America in even more compelling ways, and offer new visions and possibilities for this nation, the world, and generations yet unborn. And I want to end with a quote from Du Bois. The uplift of women is, next to the color line and the peace movement, our greatest modern cause. This Du Bois asserted in 1920, though we mainly remember what he said about the color line. Nearly 75 years later, these 3 issues that Du Bois articulated remain: the eradication of the oppression of women and people of color, and finally, as the war drums beckon in this country, building and sustaining a world of peace and justice. Thank you.
Okay, what we'd like to do now is to entertain any questions or comments that people might have after that wonderful lecture. I think that, again, we've been challenged and illuminated by the remarks, and also, been given a charge. How do we make real the vision that we see in Du Bois's work? And now you got me going back to the library. It's busy. So I'd like to open up the floor to questions. I'm sure there should be some questions and some remarks. Stand up.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Larry. You spoke about the way in which Du Bois talked about womanhood, and obviously today it's a very different relationship that black men have with black women. And I was wondering, what do you think is responsible for that? And is it possible for us to actually achieve the vision that Du Bois had?
That's a really good question.
And how?
And I might need some help answering it. The first question that you raised is a question that I have spent long hours and maybe even years trying to ponder. And I deal with it a little bit in gender talk, but let me just tell you, let me just say 2 things. I think that black men in the 19th century, coming out of slavery, and black men in the early 20th century were profoundly aware of the devastating impact of slavery on black people in general, but particularly on black women. If we could have Frederick Douglass come in this room and you told him, which is something that happened in the contemporary period, that black women were complicit with their slave masters, and if you also told him that black men were the primary victims of racism or slavery, they would just, they wouldn't know where that kind of attitude came from. So the first thing that I would say is that I think black people had a more realistic appraisal and assessment of the devastation of slavery and racism equally on men and women. And they had no reason to pit or even engage in discussion about who has been the greatest victim of racism. That was just not an issue. And one of the things that they were profoundly aware of was the inability of black women to have control over their bodies. So you had almost no black men in the 19th century saying that black women voluntarily go to the slave hut. And you didn't have them saying that the two freest people in the U.S. are white men and black women. This had been unimaginable to them. So the first thing that I would say is that they had a more accurate view of history. Now, I think that two things over time occurred within African American political discourse that began to make gender relations or these gender attitudes very, very problematic. One was the work of black sociologists like E. Franklin Frazier, who asserted early in the 20s and 30s that the black community is characterized by black matriarchy. And the implication of that is that somehow black women have assumed an adversarial position within black families. And then you begin to have all of the discourse surrounding that about how black women emasculate and how black women are dominant and loudmouth and so forth. So then, and that's discourse coming out of the 20s and 30s. And it's been discourse that's very difficult to dislodge, this black matriarchy thesis and all of the negative baggage that attaches itself to that. The other thing that I think is some very problematic things began to happen in the 60s, which in the book out there, Gender Talk, we've spent some time trying to unpack. And one of those was, as I mentioned in passing, was this conception of black liberation as being really about the recuperation of black manhood. And the assumption there was that black women are already recuperated and are already too much in the forefront and already too much in control. And then there came to be all of this demographic data which was incorrect, that black women make more money, that black women are more educated. And so you begin to create this sense of competition between black women and black men. And the discourse got really nasty in the 60s. And then you had, within the context of the civil rights movement, what Paula Giddens and other scholars have called a real resurgence of this notion that black men needed to assume their patriarchal places in this society, which is the norm. And so lots of things started happening within the civil rights struggle around gender problems. And so I think that that is one of the things that has happened. And I think that now what you see within a lot of hip-hop lyrics and music, you want to really see the battle between black men and women and these really old, disgusting, destructive, negative images of black women that permeate certain kinds of gangster rap lyrics and position black women now as the enemy. You know, promiscuous, materialistic, and what I would say youth culture doesn't realize is those are those old, racist, destructive stereotypes that we primarily fought within the dominant culture that we're now having to fight within African American culture. And it's very, I think it's very problematic. So now we have, you know, in the last decade, a discourse that's circulating within our own culture that is old, destructive, bad stuff coming out of the dominant culture that we as black people have begun to embrace. You can't imagine how much time I spend with brothers, young brothers, hearing them tell me how horrible black women are, except maybe for their mothers. You know, and there's this split between mother and other black women, but how horrible black women are. And it's very hard to to have a rational discussion about this. And I can't fully answer where all of this negative constructions of black women as demonic comes from. But I do know that it circulates within black popular culture. Now, and I mean, we know where some of it comes from. So anyway, that's just, what I would just say quickly. But I think it's a wonderful question, because this black woman hating discourse was not part of 19th century African American male discourse. It's a much more recent development. Does anybody else want to comment about that?
The very self-hating is destructive internally.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's a control that comes that destroys the internal structure of that black community, and its tremendous power for support. I think you can see it in other kinds of literature, older kinds of literature, as well. I think that, well, I'm doing a study on a different subject, but I think that pattern of taking something that was considered something as a control mechanism in the dominant culture that gets inculcated in the minority culture and becomes like a control mechanism that is embraced within the minority culture can be incredibly hard to eradicate. And especially if that minority culture has within it a class structure of its own. And I think you can see that at work too, along color lines. And within the black culture, you have almost unspoken but real differentiation along wealth and
It's not unspoken.
Status. That one of the reasons that Judge Thomas was so against minority support was because he was not part of the Jack and Jill structure when he was young, and he didn't get a lot of support when he was a young man.
Not so true, but it's not true. He didn't get support in his life a little bit.
Maybe I misheard, but that was one of the rationales that was given, because he resented the fact that there were other blacks who were given support, and therefore he didn't feel it was fair to give some. But the cruelty we can impose, even within any culture, whether it's of whatever stripe, that these cultural assumptions we carry can do more damage almost to ourselves than anything from the outside.
Well, I wouldn't agree with. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say more damage. I wouldn't say that.
Well, but it can be more insidious and harder to see and harder to eradicate.
I mean, one of the things that I like, one of the reasons I think it's really instructive to look at people like DuBois and Frederick is that they name these things. They had no problems going inside the community and naming what they saw.
But they weren't, yeah.
Okay, and there was not this sense of if you don't air dirty linen and you don't talk about things. I mean, the fact that Mays, for example, would write in his autobiography what his situation was in his household. He wasn't burdened by this notion that I can't speak about what I experienced. What he wanted people to know that this is one of the real bad things about alcohol. It results in domestic abuse. And so to me, that's an example of not closing your eyes and not hiding and naming. Basically what he says is, I decided at age 12 I wasn't going to drink. And he wants other folk, to see that, rather than saying I grew up in a household where everything was wonderful.
Well, and he was also willing to criticize Washington, because he was saying, look, you are supporting the structure that allows black people to be trained only as subservient roles, and not to support those with the intellectual capacity to be supported at their highest intellectual capacity. I mean, he was a fascinating man and very, very, I think, superb, as you have said, is exceptional from any culture. And his articulation and his very, very careful argumentation about the ways in which he differs and differentiates himself from Washington was extremely refined and very, very careful, but that he does so clearly speak to the fact that you cannot free a people without supporting them if you want them to have to rise to the level of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment rights that were supposedly given to them. And
I see a few, I hate to just to cut in, but I see a few more hands, and so I want to get other people involved in the discussion. I saw Joe first.
Yeah, I hate to speak because I know that there are students here who really probably want to ask questions, right?
Yeah,
So,
they're dying
to. Well, then I'll keep my hand down. Go ahead.
You're going to defer?
I'll defer, yeah.
Okay, Matt, and then I saw your hand and then your hand.
Yeah, you already gave us one example of the lyrics in hip-hop. Again, more like just internal things that it means, black women. And I guess I'm just wondering, what would be some practical means across, in the modern age, across like racial lines, maybe on a political level, civil level, even a personal level? What kind of measures, practical measures, could be taken to like achieve more of the ideals that we talked about, that you talked about earlier?
Well, first of all, I think we have to have these kinds of conversations. I mean, I think that we have to start talking more about gender. I mean, and that's really what I was trying to. I think that we have to have more gender discussions among young people. And I'm talking about cross-racial, cross-generational, which is what that book Our Back is about. It's called Gender Talk. And we basically need to have more of these kinds of conversations. And I think part of that conversation is also knowing a little bit about our history. I think that we don't know that we've had these radical people in the Americas, black, white, brown, who have been very committed to the eradication of gender oppression. Because we just talk, very much about race. So I think that that's one thing. Now, there's some very practical things that can happen with respect to that rap. So first of all, let me just say, over 60% of the consumers of rap music now are white people. Young, white, mostly males. Okay, so that has created, I think, an even more robust market for this junk. That is a huge industry now being exported all over the world. So you're talking about how capitalism and destructive imagery get in the bed together, and it becomes very difficult to get out. So I think that we need to talk about what it means that the primary consumers of the worst of rap music, and I want to say that I'm not talking about all rap music, but some of the worst of it. Who's listening to it? And now it's going all over the world. I think that we have to actively boycott some of that stuff. I think that we have to talk about it, and I think the young people in particular, students I teach, who tell me they don't listen to the lyrics, they just like the beat, because they just don't think that there's anything negative about it. But I tell you, I've seen little 3 and 4 years. I've been at the grocery store and other places and see little black children saying those horrible lyrics. They don't even know what they're saying. And so, can you imagine what it is going to be like to grow up in a sexually saturated and an unhealthy sexually saturated world in which that's what's going into your head over and over and over and over again. So I think that we have to start speaking out about what this stuff is doing. And people are beginning now to do some empirical studies and seeing the relationship between a lot of violence in relationships, in dating situations, and a lot of other misogynistic behavior, and the culture that permeates that stuff. So I think that we have to start talking about it. And I think the young people have to begin to have a more political, analytical perspective about popular culture than they presently do, other than, well, I just like the beat.
You speaking, Ginger, talked about Mike Tyson's trial and the subsequent berating for him in Harlem. And in reading the book, I was wondering your feelings about the celebration of sport in America, particularly major televised sports, male-dominated sports, and how that serves as an excuse for a wide variety of behaviors, including abuse of women.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think sports, which is a major obsession, is a major site for the production of a kind of masculinity that's very narrow and very rigid. Aggression. I mean, one of the statistics that's very, very disturbing is that the day where women in the U.S. experience the most violence is the day after the Super Bowl. So what that means is there's a huge connection. There's a huge connection in this unhealthy culture that we live in. And I'm talking about the whole American culture, between sports and violence, between any lasting notions of what constitutes a manhood, which is the sports model, and why it's more difficult to envision more constructive notions of manhood. And sports is a main culprit. And when you think about it, this is why it's very difficult. The extent to which sports is also a way that black men in particular experience. You're